The world of Athos lay under a red sky that never rested, its storms whispering across the plains, where broken towers bent like old bones, and the people in the city of Lumengate waited for another strike from the Empire above their heads. The air trembled as fire fell from the clouds, shaking the shelters and painting the night in colors of ash and fear. The imperial order had come down from high command that Athos must be punished for disobedience, and an example must be made. And so, the destroyers circled while the citizens hid in basements, holding their children close and counting seconds between the impacts. One of those citizens was a young officer named Sarit, standing in the command tower, watching the horizon burn and wondering how many stories began with obedience and ended with silence. He had been told the Empire protected order, but looking at the sky, he saw only destruction that felt empty. Far beyond the Empire's borders, someone heard their call for help. A faint old SOS pulse from a relay thought to be long dead. It traveled through dust clouds and forgotten channels until it reached a deep place between stars, where unknown machines listened in. That silence, a signal, woke. It spoke in a human voice, clear, calm, and without fear. Attention. Athos medical relief inbound, cease bombardment, open truce. Window 30 minutes, failure to comply will end in protection of civilians by all means allowed. The voice was not loud, but it carried weight. It spoke, as if truth itself had chosen to move through radio and metal and reach this broken world. Sarit looked at the comm screen and saw an origin mark that the Imperial system could not name it. Simply read human. In the shelters, people heard it too. Some thought it was a cruel trick, others whispered an old forbidden name. Deathworlders, the humans from the blue planet, the ones the Empire had erased from history long ago. The voice gave them something they had not felt in years. It gave them a reason to wait one more minute instead of surrendering. A mother named Hera sat beside her son and whispered that maybe mercy had found a way to speak again above them. The bombardment paused, not because the Empire had mercy, but because Imperial scanners had found something strange in orbit. Something big and dark where nothing had been before. The object revealed itself not with light, but with the way light bent around it. The Imperial ship Eburn tried to scan, but the data broke apart like water. Slipping from a closed hand, a new transmission arrived. Not from the Empire, but from that void-shaped vessel. Medical pods descending marked zones under defense. Further aggression toward civilians will end engagement by measures of absolute defense. These were simple words, but to the Imperial captain they sounded like law written by gods. The first pods fell slowly, glowing with blue descent trails. They opened on impact, spreading breathable air and medicine drones that moved like silver insects, over rubble, closing wounds and restoring pulse. Sarit watched the sensors report impossible energy readings. No radiation, no aggression, only presence, and a feeling that the night itself now had a heartbeat. He wondered if this was how legends began, a quiet act that refused cruelty while the Imperial fleet argued over what to do. The human ship simply continued its work, every drone landing like a promise, every beacon lighting a circle where no more fire was allowed on the surface. Hara stepped out from her shelter, holding her boy's hand, watching the glowing circles and the gentle hum that filled the air. Her people whispered prayers they had forgotten the words to. In orbit, the Imperial Council grew angry. They ordered a full bombardment to erase the interference, but the fleet hesitated. The Empire had 10 hulls for every ghost, yet something in their bones refused to move. Sarit received new orders to coordinate fire, but before he could obey, another message came directly to his Consul Athos command. This is Envoy Mara of the Starborn. Hold fire for 6 minutes while we mark evacuation paths. If your council fires again, we will stop their guns. The voice was calm, kind, and final. Sarit's hands shook as he looked at the other officers. None of them spoke. He made the decision. Tower will hold fire. 6 minutes granted. On the surface, evacuation began. The gates opened. People moved through dust and ruin toward the safe zones marked by the unknown ship above. Hara felt wind for the first time in days, clean and cold. Her son laughed, though he did not know why. Across the city, screens flickered with the image of the black ship, holding position like a mountain among stars. The Imperial flagship received word from the throne end. The interference end the world if needed. Pride demanded obedience, yet in the command tower, Sarat could no longer pretend that destruction was duty. He looked at the burning horizon, then at the calm field around the human ship and knew something had changed forever. The clock ran down, 6 minutes ended. Silence stretched the Empire prepared to fire, and above them the Deathworlders waited patient and unflinching to keep their word for one small world that had dared to cry for help. The sky was no longer red but silver where their shadow fell, and in that light Athos took its first breath of courage, and the legend of the Starborn began to live again. The Empire had never been challenged inside its own borders, not in living memory, and when the Starborn ship appeared without warning or signature, the pride of 1,000 systems began to crack. Though no one dared admit it in the open halls of command, the Council demanded proof of hostility, demanded reason to destroy what they could not name, and so they called the appearance an illusion, a trick of censors, or a coward's bluff. But every officer who looked at the sky saw the truth, that something was there, something vast and silent and awake. The flagship, Eburn Prime, drifted into high orbit to make a display of strength. Its weapons hummed with power, and its admirals prepared a volley to erase the myth once and for all. While below the citizens of Athos held their breath, Sarat stood again at the cracked window of his tower, the stormlight from the burning fields coloring his uniform with faint red. He had lived his life by order and numbers, but now the numbers made no sense. The sensors said mass readings beyond known limits. The relay screens showed nothing where light should reflect, as if the human ship refused to exist by the Empire's logic. Yet every radio on the planet could hear the quiet voice that still spoke instructions for evacuation and relief routes in clear, gentle rhythm. Sarat wanted to believe it was mercy, not manipulation, because mercy was rarer than fuel in the Empire. He touched the console once more and listened to the hum of the transmission repeating every 30 seconds, as if the universe had learned patience far. Below on the plains, Hera and her son moved through the crowd of evacuees. The air smelled cleaner now, each step taking them closer to the northern road, where blue beacons shimmered above the dust drones floated overhead. Humming softly they did not carry weapons. They carried containers of water and medical foam and banners of light that marked safe corridors. When the Empire's patrol skiffs appeared on the horizon, the drones hovered between them and the refugees, projecting a shield of pale glow. The skiffs halted uncertain. For the first time, soldiers inside whispered about ghosts and ancient wars, and the Deathworlders who never surrendered. The captain of one skiff ordered a test shot at the drones, but the moment the beam flared, it vanished mid-air, bending harmlessly aside, leaving nothing but silence and the reflection of their own fear. In orbit, the Imperial admirals ordered their gunners to lock targets on the human vessel, named on intercepted code as Vowkeeper. The order was met with hesitation. No one wanted to be the one who fired first on something that bent reality around it. Finally, one ship broke rank, its plasma lances striking through clouds toward the black silhouette above the planet. The lances hit nothing, and yet something hit back. Not with destruction, but with control. Every weapon aboard the Imperial ship went offline. Every reactor cooled as if the laws of physics had been rewritten by will. The ship hung motionless, harmless, and whole, like a child's toy left on a table. Then a message came across every Imperial frequency. This engagement has been logged unlawful. Cease hostilities immediately. On the ground, people saw only the glow in the sky fading. To calm it, look to them, as if a storm had been caught and folded away. Sarat saw the readings drop. His superior shouted for retaliation, but the command systems refused to obey, as if the machines themselves had chosen neutrality. He realized then that the Starborn were not fighting a war, they were teaching one to stop. For a moment, he almost laughed at the absurdity that it took strangers from a death world to make the Empire remember restraint. Hera reached the evacuation zone where open fields stretched to the northern hills. She saw med tents unfolding by themselves. Drones lowering crates filled with supplies and messages written in universal pictographs. Words of comfort that did not promise victory, only survival. She thought of the voice that had spoken from the sky and wondered what kind of people sent aid before they sent fire. The wind shifted, carrying the distant sound of thunder. But it was not thunder. It was the sound of another Imperial ship falling from orbit. Its systems shut down safely by the same unseen hand, No explosions, just surrender forced by understanding in the council chamber of Eburn Prime. The admirals argued one side demanded total assault. The other whispered that perhaps the myths of Earth were true. The oldest records spoke of a planet catalogued as a death world where gravity storms and predators forged creatures both fragile and fierce beyond reason. A species that grew stronger through suffering and, now that species had returned not to conquer but to forbid conquest, the thought shook them more than any weapon could. Sirit received a direct transmission from Envoy Mara. Again, her voice soft but carrying command. Athis command, your council has. Refuse dialogue. Our duty is protection, not domination. Keep your people under shelter and wait 3 minutes before any movement. We will neutralize aggressive assets without collateral damage. Sirit replied that he would comply, though he barely understood what she meant. 3 minutes later, light swept the horizon, silent arcs that left no destruction. Only disabled machinery. The Empire's cannons froze their beams, unlit their circuits cold, and for the first time in generations, the battlefield fell quiet without surrender, without victory only. Quiet Hera held her son close as the wind eased around them. She looked up and saw the shape of the human ship gliding lower. Its edges, glowing faint blue like the outline of a promise. No explosions. No celebration, only the slow realization that they were still alive across the planet. Relief spread like sunrise whispers, moved faster than official channels. They said the Deathworlders had come, and instead of bringing ruin, they had brought pause, and in that pause the people of Athis began to feel the first fragile thread of hope. The Empire above prepared its next move, pride still burning, even as the stars around Athis shifted in strange new patterns. The Starborn had drawn a line in the void, and everyone who saw it understood that it was not a threat. It was a boundary between cruelty and choice, and soon the galaxy would decide which side it belonged to. The silence that followed the Starborn intervention was heavier than any sound the Empire had ever known across the orbit of Athis. Fleets drifted like stunned beasts, their weapons dead, their pride suspended between confusion and disbelief. For generations they had believed themselves invincible, yet now they were staring at a single human vessel that had done what no rebellion, no rival empire, no machine intelligence had ever achieved. It had made them stop not through fear of destruction, but through an authority that felt older than their own throne aboard the Imperial flagship Eburn Prime. Admiral Kale paced before the main display, his golden armor reflecting the faint light from the disabled cannons. His voice carried both anger and something dangerously close to fear. He demanded a scan, a weapon test, any sign of weakness, but the ship's AI refused commands as if it too had chosen to wait. He slammed a fist on the console and shouted that myths did not have the right to disarm empires far below on the surface. Sirit stood among the refugees, watching the horizon, still trembling from the aftershock of whatever the humans had done. He could feel in the air a strange calm, not peace, but the quiet that comes when both sides realize the world has changed. He had seen the Empire crush uprisings, burn colonies, even silence whole systems. Yet he had never seen mercy used as a weapon before in the refugee field. The drones continued their work, their glowing eyes scanning for wounds they stitched. They cleaned, they carried children away from rubble, and never once demanded loyalty. Their markings bore the same word over and over in a language older than the Empire. Earth Hera stood with her son near the medical tents, listening to the chatter of others around her. Some believed the Starborn were angels. Others whispered they were monsters pretending to be saviors. But she had seen their actions, and she knew they had come not to rule, but to remind her world of its worth. She watched one drone repair a broken transmitter, then broadcast a message in a dozen languages, all saying the same phrase in calm rhythm. Civilians safe, ceasefire. Continue evacuation. We will protect all who do not attack the people. Began to move again. But this time there was no panic. There was something close to trust, and that frightened the Empire more than any weapon. In orbit, the Imperial command finally found its courage to retaliate, or perhaps its fear disguised itself as courage. 3 destroyers were ordered to test the human defenses, their captains, young, proud, eager to erase shame. They aligned their formations and fired volleys of energy that split the clouds and descended toward the Starborn ship. But instead of striking metal or shield, the beam slowed, twisted and faded like rain dissolving. Into mist, then a new wave of force rippled outward, invisible yet undeniable. The destroyer's systems dimmed, their power drained, their reactors went silent. The ships hung weightless and harmless in space, caught in some unseen net of control. Voice of Envoy Mara filled every channel once again. This act is recorded as an assault upon civilians. The law of protection will be enforced. You will withdraw your fleets within 1 hour, or your weapons will be rendered permanently inert. Spoke without emotion, without anger. And that terrified the admirals even more because it was the tone of someone who did not threaten but simply stated the inevitable. Admiral Kale ordered his communication officers to jam the frequency, but the systems no longer responded. Every console showed the same line of text, the oath of the Starborn. We defend the innocent, we do not seek war, we finish what others begin. Sarah listened to the transmission echo across the channels. He realized that the humans were not simply soldiers. They were enforcers of an older code, a law built from the ashes of their own survival. He wondered, what kind of world could make people like that? People who could build weapons strong enough to crush empires, yet still choose to use them as shields. He thought of his oath to the Empire, and how hollow it felt now compared to the Starborn's simple promise to protect those who could not defend themselves. On the planet, the Imperial legions still stationed on the surface received new orders from orbit to resume the purge. Their commanders hesitated, but pride forced their hands. They began marching toward the refugee zones, determined to reclaim their honor as they reached the edge of the safe zones. Marked by the blue beacons, their armored vehicles slowed. Engines choking under unseen interference, soldiers tried to fire, but their rifles locked. The air shimmered and a field of energy spread across the plain, stopping them in their tracks. From within that field, figures appeared, human figures tall, armored, the surface of their suits glowing like stars seen through water. They carried no visible weapons, only staffs that pulsed with faint light. One of them stepped forward. Her armor marked with the symbol of a rising sun, she spoke through the amplifiers, her voice resonating across the field. You are standing on protected ground. No empire, no fleet, no flag has claim. Here, stand down and live, or step forward and be judged by your own actions. The Imperial commander tried to respond with defiance, shouting that no alien law bound the Empire. He took one step past the beacon line, and his armor froze, locked solid in an instant. He fell to his knees, paralyzed, but alive. His soldiers stared at him, then at the human envoy, who turned away without another word. Sarah watched the feed from his tower, his pulse racing. The Empire had never met an enemy who refused to kill it, had no idea how to respond to strength that asked for restraint. Instead of obedience, he turned toward his subordinates and ordered them to stand down, ignoring the shouts from superiors through the command net. The war was changing shape, and he would rather live to understand it than die clinging to broken pride. Hara and her son saw the human figures vanish again into light, the sky above them clearing to reveal the stars for the first time in weeks. She did not know what those humans wanted or why they cared, but she knew one truth written in her heart when the universe had abandoned her world. It was the Deathworlders who had answered the final SOS, and she whispered a quiet thank you to the sky, not knowing that her words were heard across channels where silent listeners recorded every breath, every act, every heartbeat of this moment for the history that was now being rewritten. And far above, in the vast quiet between suns, the ship Vowkeeper turned slightly, its engines flaring with soft light. The humans were already preparing for what they knew must come next. The Empire would not surrender, it would escalate, and the Starborn were ready for the storm that pride always summoned when the powerful met the unbroken will of Earth. The Empire gathered its rage like a wounded beast cornered by its own reflection across the outer systems. Orders flew faster than light. War councils shouted for restoration of honor, and fleets once scattered for patrol were recalled to orbit Athos. In a show of power, the admirals renamed the Operation Cleansing Flame, their message clear, that the Empire would not yield to any myth or ghost from a forgotten death world. The flagship Eburn Prime, now ringed by a dozen cruisers, shone like a miniature sun above the red planet. Every weapon recalibrated, every mind fixed on revenge, and yet none dared fire without new codes. Because the Starborn had already proven they could end any weapon before it spoke, the Council of Governors demanded results. and Admiral Kale promised them spectacle. He would burn the sky until no shadow remained. Down below in the refugee camps, the people of Athos prepared for another end. Though this time there was no panic, only the steady work of those who had already seen death once and found themselves alive after it. Hara helped move supplies between tents, her son now resting inside a medic pod breathing clean air. For the first time in days, the drones of the Starborn still hovered, tending the wounded and relaying quiet instructions to keep distance from the southern ridges where energy readings grew unstable. Sarah had moved command operations to the plains, with the evacuees refusing to take shelter in the Imperial towers that now looked more like tombstones than fortresses. He listened to the calm updates from Envoy Mara, whose voice came through on every channel. Not as command, but as constant reassurance, the kind that makes courage feel possible. Above the planet Vowkeeper rotated slowly like a black cathedral surrounded by lightless escorts, each one smaller. Yet carrying the same seal of Earth, the Starborn fleet was not large, but it moved with precision. Every maneuver exact, every pulse timed like a heartbeat. Mara stood in her command chamber surrounded by hollows of the planet and the Imperial fleet. She knew the Empire would never surrender out of reason, only out of exposure. She had gathered proof of what the Empire had done on its border worlds: the slave labor, the tribute harvest, the silenced systems that kept its economy alive. In her databanks were records of entire planets stripped bare, and her mission now shifted from defense to revelation. They would not destroy the Empire. They would reveal it and let the galaxy decide what kind of power it followed. Sarah listened as the data streams from the Starborn fleet began transmitting to every open channel across the Empire. He watched intercepted messages carrying images of ruined colonies, forced labor camps, and suppressed reports from Imperial scientists who had spoken against the wars. Truth once hidden now spreading faster than any missile could travel. The citizens of Athos saw it too. Some wept. Others stared in disbelief, realizing that the Empire's strength had always been built on silence, and now that silence was breaking, Kale in orbit saw the same and roared with fury. He accused the Starborn of lies, called them manipulators. Trying to weaken discipline, he ordered the execution of all Imperial personnel who failed to fire on command. Sarah received the order and deleted it without hesitation. His loyalty had cracked the moment he heard the word protection spoken by someone who did not need to. The Starborn knew what was coming. They had read the pattern of empires before Mara's second officer confirmed multiple energy spikes from the Imperial fleet. They were arming the planetary purification sequence, an ancient weapon meant to turn atmosphere into fire, designed for rebellion control, not for war. Its use here would erase everything, including their own troops. Mara closed her eyes for a moment and whispered an old phrase that humans once used on their death world. Hold fast and hold human then. She gave the order for containment deployment. Every Starborn ship opened their gravitational anchors, embedding them into subspace, forming a web that reached through the planet's magnetosphere like threads of invisible steel. On the surface, the sky turned dark, not with clouds but with movement, as if the stars themselves were shifting in fear. Sarah stood beside Hera and pointed upward where faint silver lines crisscrossed the heavens. It was beautiful and terrifying. The Starborn were building a cage not to trap, but to shield the planet from the inferno to come above them. The Imperial flagship unleashed the first wave of the purification array, streaks of light descending like false comets, then bending away the moment they touched the Starborn barrier. The energy folded upon itself, consuming its own source. 1,000 small suns flared and died without touching ground. The Empire realized too late that its own weapon was becoming unstable. Kale screamed for retreat, but the power could not be recalled. The purification matrix was overloading. It would detonate in orbit, taking the entire fleet with it. Mara heard the readings spike and issued a final command: shift containment to absorb vector collapse all ships. Brace for discharge. The fleet of the Starborn glowed bright white for one breath of eternity. Then the light vanished, and only silence remained when the echoes cleared. The Imperial ships were gone, not destroyed, but frozen in orbit, like fossils. Wrapped in crystal down below, the wind rose across the plains. The people saw light shimmer through the clouds and fall like rain, soft silver particles drifting down, leaving trails that healed scorched stone and cooled the air. Sarah knelt in the Dust staring at the sky, he could not speak. There were no words for what he had just seen. A civilization's wrath undone by calm precision. Hara held her son as he opened his eyes and smiled at the light. She felt tears and laughter in the same breath because they had survived again. Not by luck, but because someone far away believed their lives were worth saving. In the silent orbit, Mara looked at the frozen fleet of the Empire, her reflection shining in the dark glass of the command deck. She did not smile. She simply whispered one line into the void message, complete. Truth delivered, prepare tribunal. The war had not ended, but something deeper had begun. The age of fear was cracking. The galaxy would soon see its own reflection, and decide if it could bear to look any longer, and on the surface of Athos under the soft silver rain. Humanity's legend grew one heartbeat at a time. The galaxy trembled under the news that spread like fire through the trade networks. Every relay, every outpost, every shadow market spoke the same name, the Starborn. The Deathworlders who had returned from myth to stand between tyranny and survival. The frozen Imperial fleet around Athos became a monument visible from orbit, its once proud ships. Now silent sculptures of pride turned to memory. The Imperial Corps could not ignore the shame their throne world seethed with fury and denial. Emissaries called it rebellion propaganda. A trick of light crafted by earthborn liars, yet in the silence. Between their words, fear moved like an invisible tide because they all knew the Empire's purification array had vanished without destruction. Something beyond their science had simply taken its fire away. On the surface, Sarret helped the survivors rebuild the outer camps. His rank meant little now, and he preferred it that way. The Imperial insignia on his chest felt like ash, so he tore it off and threw it into the dust beside the ruins that used to be his command post. Hara worked beside him, helping distribute supplies from the Starborn crates, her son now strong enough to run through the fields that weeks ago had been burned flat around them. The air carried a new scent. Not smoke, but rain. Real rain drawn from seeded clouds released by the human drones. It fell softly over the plains, washing the soot from the shattered stones and from the faces of those who had forgotten how clean water felt. Sarret looked toward the horizon where the Starborn ship still lingered high above, unmoving like a guardian refusing to sleep. Inside Vowkeeper, the crew monitored thousands of transmissions, many of them calls for help from other border systems, suffering under the same Imperial chains. Mara listened to each voice with quiet focus. Her officers begged her to intervene, but she reminded them the Starborn oath was not conquest but defense. Every rescue had to serve the law of balance. Otherwise, they would become the same as those they fought. She knew the Empire would strike. Again, not here, but somewhere desperate enough to bait a reaction. She ordered her intelligence wing to trace the next target, and within hours, they founded an outer moon named Yeran, known for mining rare gas fields and harboring defectors among its population. The Empire had chosen it for punishment and had already dispatched a full fleet. Mara set course immediately, knowing that protection often meant standing in the line of wrath. Sarret volunteered to help the Starborn relay evacuation. Messages across the old Empire channels, he used his codes and authority to broadcast warnings under the signature of a loyal officer. Knowing full well it was treason in the eyes of his superiors. Yet for the first time, his choices felt his own. Hera watched him work and saw in his face the same calm determination she had heard in the Starborn envoy's voice. She asked him if he feared what would come after, and he smiled faintly, saying, fear was only loyalty without direction. She did not fully understand, but she felt it was true. The people of Athos began to rebuild their broken city, lighting torches at night, not for defense but for remembrance. Every flame a quiet oath that they would never again live as examples of obedience. Far away, the Imperial throne prepared its vengeance. The High Lord Chancellor decreed that all Deathworlders and their sympathizers were to be hunted to extinction. Any planet offering refuge to humans would face annihilation. Entire fleets were rearmed, and a new weapon awakened from old archives. A dimensional rift generator designed to erase targets from existence. Kyle, who had survived the disaster at Athos, was placed in charge of this new weapon. He swore he would erase the Starborn and deliver the ashes of Earth itself to the throne to prove his loyalty, though deep inside he carried the same tremor of doubt that haunted every Imperial soldier. Since the day their weapons failed against mercy, When the Starborn fleet reached Yeran, they found no army waiting, only ruins and refugees. The Empire had already struck, testing their new weapon and leaving behind no crater, no wreckage, only absence. Entire regions of the moon, gone as if erased from reality. Mara stared at the readings, her voice low as she realized what the Empire had unleashed. They were no longer trying to rule. They were trying to rewrite the map of existence itself. She ordered the fleet to deploy containment anchors and rescue whatever remained within the fading edges of the rift fields. The surviving miners spoke of light that folded upon itself, and voices whispering numbers, as if the universe itself had been rewritten. Back on Athis, Sirit intercepted the first reports of the new weapon, and understood that the battle was moving beyond anything a single world could survive. He transmitted the data to the Starborn using the same forbidden channels he had once used for orders. He knew this act would mark him a traitor forever. But the choice was already made. Hera saw him send the signal and knew without words that he had given up his old life for the chance of something better. She told him that if humanity could hear their voices, maybe they would not let the galaxy fall alone in orbit. Vowkeeper received his message, and Mara stood before the star map as the data unfolded before her eyes. The rift weapon was not only a threat to the Starborn but to the balance of creation. It fed on gravity itself, and if unleashed fully could tear open the boundary between matter and void. She turned to her officers and gave a new order. The Starborn would not retreat. They would stop the Empire here, even if it meant binding their own ships to the weapons. Their oaths were clear: protect life, protect truth, protect choice at any cost. The storm was rising again across the stars. Every Empire fleet now converging on the silent world, where a handful of humans and one scarred officer waited for the next dawn that might never come. Sirit looked up that night and saw the Starborn ship flare brighter against the dark sky, a promise made of light and defiance, and he whispered the same words Mara had spoken. Hold fast and hold human, knowing the meaning at last that survival was not enough without honor, that courage meant standing even when the world had already decided to fall. And as the wind moved through the plains of Athis, it carried those words like a prayer toward the coming fire. Empire came like a storm that swallowed its own reflection, stretching from one end of the void to another. Thousands of ships moving in formation so vast it looked like a moving continent of fire and steel. The stars dimmed beneath their engines, and every communication frequency carried the same cold declaration. The Deathworlders will be erased. The galaxy will remember obedience. Mara stood at the center of Vowkeeper's command hall, surrounded by the silent light of tactical maps. Her eyes tracing the paths of incoming fleets like threads of a noose. She did not tremble. She only breathed slow and steady as she gave her orders. The Starborn fleet would not flee. They would hold the line over Yeran and prevent the Empire from using the rift weapon again. She knew they were outnumbered hundreds to one. But the Starborn did not measure victory by numbers. They measured it by how long they could protect what mattered before falling. Sirit watched from the surface of Athis. As the sky changed color again, the old Imperial relay towers flickered alive, broadcasting fragments of the coming battle. He could see shapes in orbit, vast silhouettes, and a shimmer of energy that looked like the fabric of reality tearing apart. He felt powerless, but he knew his choices had meaning now. He began transmitting the coordinates of Imperial troop convoys still hidden within the cities, feeding that data to the Starborn to help them predict movements he knew the Empire would trace it back to him. Yet he kept sending his voice steady, as if each message carried not fear but faith. Hera stayed near him, holding her son, who now asked questions about the people in the sky. She told him they were the ones who listened, when no one else would above Yeran. The battle began in silence and light. The Empire opened with orbital fire that spread across the void like rain across a mirror. The Starborn answered, not with destruction, but with geometry. Their ships formed spirals, weaving between lines of plasma, absorbing kinetic strikes and bending gravity to redirect missiles back into the void. The Empire could not understand what they were seeing. Their computers calculated trajectories, but every calculation failed. The human ships moved as if they knew where the enemy would be before the orders were even spoken. This was not war. It was precision, born of centuries surviving on a world that never forgave weakness. The rift weapon hung behind the Imperial lines, a massive structure glowing with unnatural light, its center pulsing like the heart of a dying star. Admiral Kale stood aboard the weapon platform surrounded by engineers, his face lit by the radiance of power he believed he could control. He commanded them to charge the core to full capacity to erase Uran and every trace of the Starborn once and for all. But as the energy rose, the readings began to shift, strange fluctuations spreading through the containment fields. The humans had already touched the weapon from afar. Mara had anticipated this moment. She had sent a team of Starborn operatives cloaked in gravitational folds directly into the rift generator. Their goal was not to destroy it, but to rewrite it inside the weapon's heart. The operatives moved through corridors filled with light that bent around their bodies. They carried no guns, only rods that emitted pulses of data, rewriting the equations that powered the device. One of them was a human named Rin, born on Earth. Raised among the Starborn academies, he believed that the only way to stop the Empire was to let the weapon consume itself. His team worked in perfect silence, each heartbeat timed with the energy surges above their heads. Then the alarms screamed. The Empire had detected them. Rin shouted through the link that they were close to completion. Mara heard his voice echo across the bridge, steady, proud, certain, and she whispered a single word. Continue. The Imperial troops rushed through the corridors, firing blindly through the blinding light. Rin reached the final conduit and placed his hand on the control sphere. Flooding it with Starborn code, his suit began to burn from the inside. But he did not stop. The weapon's light shifted color from red to blue and then to white across the fleet. Both sides paused as the pulse spread outward like a ripple through a pond. Every weapon, every engine, every power cell began to hum in unison. The Starborn ships held position, their shields brightening. To absorb the coming discharge, Mara realized what was about to happen and ordered all hands to brace for gravitational inversion. The rift weapon imploded, not with sound, but with gravity folding inward, consuming itself in perfect silence before bursting outward into pure light that filled the system for one long, endless moment. When the light faded, the Imperial fleet was gone, erased, without wreckage, without smoke. Their presence reduced to echoes across radiation bands. The Starborn ships remained, though, their hulls cracked and their anchors overloaded. Vowkeeper itself drifted wounded, but alive, the void where Uran had been burned with residual light like a scar on space itself. Rin and his team never returned, but their names would be written into the Starborn Oath. Across the galaxy, the shockwave of the implosion was seen by every civilization known. Some called it divine, others called it madness, yet all knew it was human. The Empire's throne world fell into panic. Their fleets cut off, their communication shattered, the myth of eternal dominion, undone by those they had mocked as primitives. The galaxy began to whisper, not of fear but of possibility, that power built on cruelty could indeed fall, that a small voice from a small world could reshape the stars. Sirit saw the sky turn white for an instant, then return to calm. He felt the ground steady beneath his feet, and in that silence, he knew the Starborn had done what none thought possible. They had not conquered, they had ended the cycle of domination. Hara stood beside him, tears in her eyes as she watched her son draw shapes in the dust, saying he wanted to be like them one day. Someone who listens, someone who helps. She smiled and told him that maybe one day the Starborn would not be a legend but a way of living, in orbit. Vowkeeper drifted quietly. Her hull scarred, her engines faint, but her message clear. The humans had survived again, not by being the strongest, but by being the ones who refused to give up. Mara looked at the fading stars and whispered that the oath was not finished yet. They had won a battle, but the truth still needed to be spoken across every world that once believed the Empire's lies. And as her ship turned slowly toward the core systems, the Starborn prepared to deliver the final verdict of Earth to those who had forgotten what mercy truly meant. The silence after the battle stretched for days. The stars themselves seemed hesitant to move, as if the universe needed time to understand what had just happened across the systems once ruled by the Empire. Confusion turned into panic. Governors locked their channels. Entire sectors went dark, and those who had once bowed to the Imperial throne now questioned whether their loyalty had ever been anything more than fear. Mara watched from the bridge of the damaged Vowkeeper, as messages poured in from hundreds of worlds calling her name, calling for truth, calling for the Starborn her crew worked, quietly repairing the broken hull plating, patching power conduits, and tending to the wounded. Yet despite the exhaustion in their faces, there was something else there. A quiet pride that did not need to be spoken. They had done what no one believed. Possible they had stood against an empire and survived. On the surface of Athos, the people built fires along the riverbanks, as the night winds carried the scent of wet soil through the camps. The world that had once been marked for destruction now glowed with life. Children ran through the fields, chasing the drones that still floated overhead, their soft blue lights guiding the workers who rebuilt homes from the ruins. Sarah stood near the edge of the old command tower, now broken in half, and overgrown with green vines. He watched the horizon, thinking of the thousands of lives lost and the billions that had been saved by strangers from a blue world he had never seen. Hara approached him, carrying her son in her arms. The boy waved. A small piece of metal that he had found among the debris, it bore the mark of Earth, and Sarah felt something tighten in his chest. The emblem was not a symbol of power. It was a memory of endurance. In orbit, Vowkeeper's communication decks opened to the galaxy. Mara had decided that the time for silence was over. She began transmitting the truth of the Empire's crimes to every open channel in every known language. Her words carried no threat, only witness. She told of the forced labor planets, the erased histories, the millions left to die for tribute quotas. She told of the Starborn Oath, how humanity had learned on its own savage world that life was fragile and sacred, how they had promised never to rule but only to guard and teach where they were needed across the stars. Her message echoed like an ancient song. One line repeated over and over: protection is not weakness. Mercy is not surrender. Justice is not vengeance. The Empire's core worlds received the transmission first. The High Lords tried to censor it, but their systems failed. Their networks disrupted by the same encryption that had once silenced their victims. The people of the Empire heard what their rulers had done, and for the first time they spoke against them. Riots spread across the capital cities. Soldiers refused orders. Governors defected. Whole fleets lowered their banners and opened communication with the Starborn. The throne world burned with protests that no weapon could suppress, and from those ashes, a new council of free systems began to rise. Sarah was called to the Starborn landing zone, where a small shuttle had arrived, carrying envoy Mara herself. She stepped out of the hatch wearing armor, blackened from battle, yet her presence carried peace, not authority. She greeted the people of Athos with a nod, not a speech. The crowd fell silent as she raised her hand and declared that their world was now recognized as sovereign and free under the protection of the conquered of worlds. She then turned to Sarah and handed him a small crystalline tablet. Inside it pulsed the Charter of Unity, the document that would allow Athos to govern itself under fair law without fear of the Empire ever. Returning, Sarah bowed slightly, but Mara shook her head, telling him that the age of bowing was over and that leadership meant standing tall, not kneeling. Lohara stepped forward with her son, who offered Mara the piece of metal marked with Earth. Mara took it gently and smiled, the same soft smile she had carried through every storm. She told the boy that on her homeworld storms never truly stopped, but that was how they learned to live. She promised him that if he ever looked up at the stars and saw a faint blue light, it would be Earth watching, not as a master but as a friend. Then she turned back to the crowd and spoke one final time, saying that the Starborn would now withdraw from their skies, not because their duty was done, but because they trusted Athos to guard its own light. The people bowed in respect, but Mara only placed a hand on her heart and whispered the words of the oath before boarding her shuttle once more. As Vowkeeper rose into the heavens, the people of Athos watched it vanish beyond the clouds, leaving behind nothing but the soft hum of the drones that would soon fade as well. Sarah stood beside Hara as the wind swept across the plains. He told her that he no longer knew what future waited for them, but that it was theirs now. Truly theirs. She smiled and said that maybe the universe had just needed one world brave enough to call for help, and one world stubborn enough to answer. They turned toward the rebuilt city, lights reflecting off the river like stars on water, far above the fleet of the Starborn reformed around Vowkeeper, its scarred hull glowing faintly in the light of the new dawn. Mara stood on the bridge, Watching the curve of Athis shrink below her, she recorded her final report stating that the Empire's central command had collapsed, that the Conquered was forming to oversee peace, and that the Starborn would return to their hidden home to rest and rebuild. She ended the report with a line that would later echo across every corner of known space: there is no such thing as myth, only memory waiting to awaken. As the ship entered faster than light flight, the stars stretched into lines of silver, and for one final moment before the jump, Mara closed her eyes and thought of Earth. She thought of its storms, its oceans, its endless resilience, the place that had taught her ancestors that survival was not domination, but devotion. She whispered, "Thank you, home," and the stars folded around her once more. Back on Athis, the first sunrise since the war broke over the plains, golden and quiet. The wind carried the scent of wet soil and new life. Sarat stood on the tower with Hara and her son, watching the light spread across their world. He could almost hear the hum of the Starborn engines fading into the distance, and he whispered the final line of their oath. "We hold fast. We hold human." And the day began without fear. For the first time in living memory, the galaxy had never been so quiet. Yet the quiet was alive with whispers of what had passed across the systems. Every civilization listening to transmissions from Athis and from the Starborn fleet knew that something had changed forever. The empire that once ruled through fear had been shown. That strength without mercy was fragile. That power alone could be undone by those who valued life above domination. Mara stood aboard Vowkeeper, watching the stars stretch into trails of light, as faster than light engines prepared to take them home. The ship was scarred, and its hull bore the marks of battle, yet its crew moved with calm purpose, tending to the wounded, repairing systems, and cataloging every lesson the universe had just taught them. Below on Athis, the plains had turned green. Again, rivers ran full across broken terrain, and children played among the ruins, their laughter like music that had not been heard for years. Sarat walked among them, carrying messages of unity and guidance from the Starborn. Every step he took reminded him that survival alone was not enough. It was what you did with that survival that defined a people. Hara followed beside him, her son skipping ahead, chasing the faint blue glow of drones that hovered like sentinels in the air above, carrying light and hope across the fields. The city of Lumengate had begun to rebuild from scratch its walls. No longer symbols of empire, but of endurance. Every building a promise that they would not bow again without choice. Across the remaining stars, the news of the Starborn victory traveled faster than any ship could carry it. Systems far beyond the Empire's borders celebrated quietly in hidden places, sending messages of hope and solidarity to worlds that had once cowered under tyranny. Secret meetings began to form the first seeds of the Concord of Free Worlds, a network that would enforce peace through law and witness rather than fear. Mara recorded her final transmission not as a command, but as a testament of what had been done. The Starborn had defended not to conquer, not to rule, but to show that courage and mercy could be the strongest weapons a civilization could wield. Sarat climbed the remains of the command tower overlooking the plains, feeling wind that smelled of rain and earth. And new beginnings, he thought of the Starborn, and the way they had arrived silently yet with authority, teaching the galaxy a lesson that could not be ignored. He looked at Hara and her son, and felt the weight of responsibility, not as a soldier, but as a guardian of this moment of freedom. Hara smiled and told him that sometimes the quietest voices hold the loudest power, and together they watched the horizon where the first sunrise in months painted gold across the plains, showing the scars of war and the brilliance of life surviving. Vowkeeper rose into the void, leaving a faint trail of light that seemed to touch every world that had listened to the Starborn's promise. The ship carried the lessons of Earth, its people, and its oath to protect life wherever it was threatened. Mara whispered to her crew that their work was never complete, that vigilance and courage must continue beyond the stars they had just saved. Yet even as they moved toward their hidden home, they carried hope in their hearts, hope that the galaxy could learn to stand without fear, hope that every SOS would now find a hand willing to lift, not crush. On Athis, a memorial was placed at the edge of the river where children now played. It was not grand or gilded, it bore no name, but it glowed softly with a light that mirrored the faint shimmer of the Starborn drones. a reminder that courage had arrived from the void, and that every life mattered. Every eye turned to the sky, felt that lesson deep. Inside, and the wind carried their promise into every corner of the world that had survived the Empire's wrath, and in that quiet hour the first true peace touched the planet, not the end of war, but the beginning of knowing that when the galaxy called for aid, it would not go unanswered. When the innocent cried, the Starborn would answer. When courage met cruelty, it would not bend, it would rise. And the people of Athos stood taller than ever before, knowing they had lived to see a legend become reality, and a new story begin for all who believed the end